Star Wars. The very name often evokes a powerful reaction from filmgoers, from the more casual viewer through to the die-hard, nitpicking, read and watched the entire expanded universe kind of fan. For my part, well, I was there from the beginning, well, as close as living on a base in Hong Kong would allow. I have fond memories of the feeling, the excitement of watching something that grabbed me from moment one and seeing the original trilogy unfold on the big screen, concluding with a triple bill of the entire saga that I sat through despite having a painful injury. I have some investment in the story, and I just recently got to see the now dubbed Skywalker saga conclude. It hasn't been a smooth ride though. In fact, to say that Star Wars has become a tad controversial would be understating it. In a replay of the Ghostbusters 2016 debacle, there's been a to and fro between fans of various stripes and those responsible for making sequel films. Insults were traded, studios belittled fans and critics of the films, while expecting them to turn up and watch the film, and general nastiness grew in the face of a slew of bad decisions and often overreactions as to what was going on. All of this from a film series that should be, at its core, a safe bet, something for everyone to attach a little bit of their hearts to. Let's begin our look at the genre-defining series of films with a whistle-stop tour of each of the trilogies, followed up by why I think some are calling for the last thing that the series needs. As someone who grew up with and loves the original film series, I'm more than willing to acknowledge its flaws. In fact, I kind of embrace them. But more on that later. It should be remembered that the first Star Wars films were something of a surprise. It wasn't really wanted by the studio, and no one expected it to be anything other than a throwaway film. But when it hit the screens, the audience were queuing round the blocks to see it. Much has been made of it tapping into the zeitgeist, but I'm not so sure that was as significant as the way that Lucas utilised the familiar and nostalgic imagery and narrative elements that he grew up with to form a good old-fashioned film that modernised it all with some superb, innovative and uncommonly attentive special effects. Certainly as a child, I didn't recognise the World War II imagery, the allusions to the Nazis. It was just a powerful and intimidating army of bad guys with an alluring villain, pitched at a relatively underpowered and plucky group of heroes. It's David versus Goliath, a fragile good versus a powerful evil with shades of grey in between. And that's the recipe for a compelling story. Given the films of the 70s were often very dark, very cynical, it was certainly a characteristic that prevailed for the most part. Star Wars was a breath of fresh air. It was a film full of positive attitude and exciting adventure across space and a wealth of likeable and familiar character types. It resonated with the audience. We went and saw a film that lifted us up and left us on cloud nine. For 20th Century Fox, well, they got a surprise hit on their hands. The toys and the merch were flying off the shelves and everyone was going to see the movie, with only a few voices of cynicism getting lost in the sound of the audience enjoying the hell out of it. If anything, the zeitgeist was the polar opposite to what Star Wars portrayed, with the Cold War going on, the Vietnam War having only recently ended, and the very premise of the film being one of a small but persistent resistance against a fascist regime. America as a nation wouldn't honestly recognise itself in the role of the good guys here in the movie, at least not in their contemporary state. The US was a superpower before the time that the movie was conceived, equipped with the might of an empire and certainly in the throes of post-war consolidation of worldwide power, and locked in a stalemate with its only realistic rival, the USSR. If anything, had the film been grounded in the zeitgeist, and the US could have been the empire, it was certainly not the rebels. The 70s are often characterised as a decade of pessimism, the cynical 70s versus the swinging 60s. Star Wars was the antithesis of that, and this is why I think it was so successful. It harked back to a time when it seemed so much clearer who the bad guy was. When you look at it, the things it draws on, it's actually pure nostalgia wrapped up in a shiny sci-fi coat, and I mean that without an ounce of cynicism. But it wasn't without its problems. The first film was something of an ordeal to get made. Lucas had long claimed that he had a much wider story in mind from the beginning, which I have no reason to not believe, but the extent to which he planned it is, well, that's something only he truly knows. Though he has been on record as saying that he decided to start the story in the middle with a backstory in mind, I don't think he had a very clear vision of what the Star Wars universe, as some, including Lucas himself, sometimes imply. Star Wars, as it was originally known before The Empire Strikes Back, was in pre-production when Lucas retrofitted Episode 4 with the New Hope subtitle to it, was filmed as a standalone film. Lucas deliberately left enough openings for the sequels that he may be able to struggle to get made later on, but at the time there were no guarantees that this film would even make its money back. It was a shaky start as well when Lucas screened a work cut to his filmmaker friends. He was met with quite the knockback from Brian De Palma when he reacted with, "I don't mean to sound harsh, but what is this shit?" To be fair, there was an absence of music, sound design and most of the special effects, though that would not be an unfamiliar experience for these filmmakers. But after a stressful production process, that was gonna be kind of devastating. Lucas actually got quite ill during the production of Star Wars, to the point that he was actually hospitalised at one point. And for all his troubles, he just had one of his mates tell him his work and life project is, well, shit. Steven Spielberg was more positive though, seeing something in the utter disaster that Lucas had just put before them. And it was enough of a disaster that even the opening text crawl was considered to be an irredeemable mess. So with a team of enthusiastic and talented people around him at Lucasfilm, notably Marcia, his wife, they recut and re-edited the film, while Industrial Light and Magic filled in the visuals. And of course, John Williams pulled a blinder in the form of the movie's soundtrack. Make no mistake though, this wasn't just a bit of tinkering. It was an exercise in rebuilding the film, and a lot of the film was moved and removed just to fix the languid pacing. There was a lack of urgency and diversions that Lucas had thought would work, which Marcia had to fix in the edit. For a deeper dive into that process, then please check out the excellent video How Star Wars Was Saved in the Edit, link below. Suffice to say, at least for now, the film did eventually become a sensation. Something fresh and new, though, of course, in story type and construction it relied on very well established footings. People were hungry for more, and so a higher budgeted sequel was set up. Lucas stepped away from the director's chair for a number of reasons. Publicly, because of wanting to oversee ILM and other production duties, but considering the experience of the first film, which hospitalised him like I said, I'd expect that probably played into the decision. Irvin Kershner, Lucas's former film professor, eventually got talked into the position of being the director, and he directed what is generally thought to be the best Star Wars to date. And call me daft if that doesn't have a ring of Obi-Wan showing the young Padawan how to do it. It was at this point of the film's conception that Lucas began in earnest to flesh out the backstory, including Anakin Skywalker becoming Darth Vader and even the volcano fight with Obi-Wan that put him in the suit. Though it seems the reality was that the prequels weren't in the fore of his thoughts, considering that Empire was at one point labelled as being Episode 2, becoming Episode 5 in a later draft, along with, at the time confusingly, retrofitting the first Star Wars as Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, along with some other rather notorious edits. Empire went down well with the public, though there were a few critical voices that fairly pointed out a few problems with the film, not least that it felt like what it was, a middle chapter that doesn't conclude. As trivial as it seems now, it was actually unusual for the time. Obviously, at this point it was clear that Empire wasn't a standalone film. It relied on the first Star Wars to set the universe, and concluded at a point which would today be decried as being sequel bait. If there was one thing I would be particularly critical of, it's probably that. It's kind of half a movie, which is not so much a problem now that we have home media to allow us to watch them back to back, but at the time was a much more prominent problem, not least because we had to wait a few years to conclude the story. When the final part of the OT hit production with Return of the Jedi, Lucas once again chose to stay away from the director's chair, with odd-fit names like David Lynch and David Cronenberg later having been revealed to have been under consideration for the position, and eventually settling on Richard Marquand and having Kasdan return as co-writer duties along with Lucas himself. As well received as the film was, it's often regarded as the weakest of the original trilogy. Its highs are soaring, but its low gets dangerously close to the bottom. The speeder chase, fantastic. The battle on the barge, great. Luke fighting Vader while a gloriously gloating Emperor works to turn Luke to the dark side is fan-bloody-tastic. But the Ewoks put the brakes on the film's progression while being child-pandering toy fodder, and the recycling of the Death Star meant that the recycled final battle was far less interesting, even if it was more spectacularly realised. In retrospect, Return of the Jedi was clearly running out of places to go. It was still a lot of fun though, and it left the film series in a place that meant it didn't need continuing. Sure, a new story could be created, but the loose ends were tied up tightly. Good had won, evil had been defeated, and the characters' arcs were complete. It went out with a reasonable bang, but it wasn't quite the strong finish that maybe it should have been. The weaknesses in the OT ultimately don't matter, certainly not very much for the time. As a piece of fantasy, it contained more than enough as a spectacle with a well-understood, tried and tested story arc. And there were some skilled writers, production staff, editors and directors to reel in Lucas's more wild ideas that made it feel coherent and complete enough for a regular audience, while the hardcore fans filled in the holes and filled out the Star Wars universe with their own offerings. While there are plenty of people who say that Star Wars universe is a small one, I would disagree to a large extent. The fanfiction and wider canon that's been created around the central pillar of the movies goes a long way to suggesting that there is in fact a lot of mileage here, even if it often proves contentious with some of the fans. The OT itself isn't a perfect piece of writing, and it certainly bears the marks of a universe being thought up of as they went. Would Luke and Leia have been touted as a love interest if the intent was always a sibling relationship? And what about that kind of love triangle situation involving Han Solo in the early part of the story? How did Luke get his force powers to the lightsaber grabbing level before getting any kind of training? Why was the idea that Obi-Wan would be more powerful than you can possibly imagine should he be struck down be made so prominent in the moment, only for him to turn out to be little more than the ghost who chats occasionally to Luke and not otherwise get involved? Star Wars was always an evolving process as it happened. New lore was suddenly inserted in places, characters, even beloved ones, were added with little regard for necessity, and the conceit of having to be a trilogy added a bit of flab to the last 2/3 of the whole. But it's all still very lovable, and maybe it's as much nostalgia for what I grew up with but I wouldn't change a thing about what the OT is. It's kind of a shame that Lucas didn't feel the same way, though. And so, some 16 years later, George Lucas returned to the world that made his name. Speculation on a prequel trilogy had been buzzing around for years given Lucas's renumbering of the OT, and in 1999, Episode 1 dropped. It's hard to explain just how exciting this was. Star Wars was a film that I clearly have a great fondness for, a lot of memories of. I had the films on VHS and I was eager to see what Lucas would bring us with this long-touted story of the rise of Darth Vader. Partly I'll be dealing with these movies more like one long movie than three, as that's rather what they are. They're kind of a long film in 3 parts. I sort of enjoyed the awkwardly titled Phantom Menace on the first viewing, at least at a popcorn level. But even then, when I was far less critical of films, I found myself underwhelmed. I thought to myself, maybe it needed a bigger picture of the upcoming sequels, maybe it's just a more episodic thing than we were expecting. I can't expect it to feel complete at this point. But the more it settled in, the more it felt flat. Casting was clearly a problem. Natalie Portman was inexperienced and struggling. Liam Neeson feels just like an odd choice, and Ewan McGregor was clearly trying very hard to do an Alec Guinness impersonation. For what it's worth, I think Portman and McGregor, the latter in particular, worked hard to inhabit the roles as he went through the trilogy, but given the clunky dialogue and Lucas's apparent lack of talent for directing actors, they could only go so far. McGregor is a standout in the prequels though. He is very enjoyable, as is Ian McDiarmid as Palpatine. Of course, there are 2 very prominent problems in the roster, and as much as I don't want to heap more scorn on them than the poor bastards have already had, there's Ahmed Best, who's saddled with a character that can only be described as being akin to a nettle rash on your perineum, and Jake Lloyd, who can't be blamed for his work, but who it is clear that should not have been put in the role. One of the most vehement bugbears with the film industry that I have is that all too often there's a lack of care taken when child actors are cast. It should be done with the utmost care and diligence to make sure that they're not put in a position of public humiliation. Lloyd's failures in this role are entirely and unambiguously down to Lucas, from the crappy dialogue that he had to deliver to the performance that was coaxed out of him, and worse, it damaged him, professionally and personally, and I have nothing but sympathy for him, and shame on Lucas for putting him in that position. Bear in mind that when I criticise the character, I place the blame squarely at Lucas's feet. So, The Phantom Menace opens to a scroll that focuses on politics. Get used to that, because where the OT brushes on old politics, the PT is going balls deep in what was current politics. The thing is, that would be fine, but a huge percentage of the political angle is handled with the grace that one would muster with a howitzer. For what it's worth, the core of the political intrigue does have a lot of merit. Palpatine, as a moustache-twirling villain as he can be, turns out to be an actually genuinely interesting character. Less interesting is Qui-Gon, who, as charismatic as he may be, is used to awkwardly steer the story towards the new law under the guise of teaching, while young Anakin seems to be in an effort to appeal to a young audience, which ends up being something that drags the credibility down. I do wonder if the midichlorian thing was simply a way to explain why he seems extraordinarily gifted without being able to display anything in particular, other than being a smart kid who's good at whatever he turns his hand to. Whatever that was about, it changed the nature of the Force from the OT. And the character of young Anakin really doesn't do much that's interesting other than bumble his way through mini lectures about slaves being people and accidentally flying a spaceship while inadvertently defeating the bad guys. He simply has very little character to speak of, especially when loaded down with the awful dialogue that Lucas wrote.
Are you an angel?
What?
An angel. I heard the deep space pilots talk about them. They're the most beautiful creatures in the universe.
He often speaks adult lines, and most words that fall from his lips are entirely those of Lucas, to the point that George should have just voiced a CG puppet himself. That's a common thing with Lucas's writing, though, and most of the characters speak like they're vocalising Lucas's inner monologue. On top of the Metachlorians, we have hyperspeed running, super jumping, Metachlorian-soaked ninjas as the new order of the day. And yeah, Luke did get about 4 frames of super agility in return. That's one of the film's quirks. But that was the only prep we had for what seems to be the norm now. This part of what the Jedi are and what they can do is dropped on us very early and without warning. And it surprised me at the time, as it looked so bizarre considering my experiences of what the Jedi are in the OT. Then there's the most grating and obvious problem. Jar Jar. Jar Jar encapsulates everything wrong with the entire prequel trilogy, being a cartoonish figure in look, deed and tone. I shan't go too far into the oft-stated complaints, as we all know what an abomination this character was. But what's worse is that the entire look and feel of the prequel trilogy is just concentrated into this thing that Lucas seemed to feel was so important. Though to be fair, he did get sidelined increasingly throughout the 3 films after the fans recoiled from it. There are theories out there that Jar Jar could have been a Sith or Force sensitive and so on, but I can't see how that would play out considering Lucas's intent on having the character as comic relief and child appeasement.
Jar Jar is a key to all this. If we get Jar Jar working, because he's a funnier character than we've ever had in any of the movies.
Most of these theories just seem like enthusiastic reaching, where Jar Jar just being a buffoonish character by intent just fits with many of the features of Lucas's prequels.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
Just like Jar Jar, the films are often garish CG that have a very insistent sense of humour, the likes of which would shame the most crass child's cartoon. And if there's one thing I don't need in a Star Wars film, it's the 3 bloody stooges. I mean, they have their place, but it's not in a sci-fi adventure that's also trying to explore complicated and dark political intrigue. Cartoonish villains, cartoonish action scenes and chases. It even seeps its way into the very names of the side characters, though that's nothing new, I guess. Mon Calamari for a squid race? Fucking seriously, George? Why not have a cow race called Sirloinius while we're at it? The cartoonishness even goes through to the characterisation, with Anakin giving literal yippies right through to the Gungan race, the Trade Federation, Watto, and so many others. They're all coloured by this cartoonish atmosphere. Watto is a toydarian, and he certainly dared to make toys out of him because merch. Attack of the Clones went even further with the CG, often looking like a straight-up animation more than a live-action film. There's no better example of Star Wars becoming a video game that you can't play than the pod racing scene. It's a scene that serves very little purpose and could have and should have been written out. It slams the brakes on the film's progress and is pure self-indulgence, as Lucas gets to have his Ben-Hur moment. It's just a shame it's all so very crowbarred in. So the look and the feel of the entire prequel trilogy was like a cartoon, and it was getting worse. Even Yoda was replaced with a god-awful looking digital replacement in Attack of the Clones. No doubt because Lucas suddenly wanted Yoda to leap around like a fucking loon. For all the desire to see Yoda fight, for all the fun that should have been, what we got was kind of cringe-inducing. And for that nugget of crap, we had the puppet taken away. The fight scene between Dooku and Yoda really epitomises the action of Attack of the Clones. It's George Lucas's unrestrained imagination being spilled out onto the screen with no discipline. And my God, there's a lot of sword twirling in this film. For all the great highs of the fight scenes that are in these films, there's at least twice as much of the sword guy from Indiana Jones facing off against himself, but without the payoff of being blasted by a diarrhea-crippled Harrison Ford. Attack of the Clones didn't land well with the long-term fans. While it had some interesting stuff in, like I say, the Rise of Palpatine, it was surrounded by a lot of bloat in the form of the clone stormtroopers, something that always felt at odds with the OT stormtroopers, and it seemed to be included more to provide cannon fodder for the big fights than it was to explore the historical references in Episode 4. Overall, Episode 2 felt very undisciplined, drawn out, and looked even less like a Star Wars film than Episode 1. But moving on. While I think Revenge of the Sith was the best of the prequel trilogy, it's not like it had a high bar to leap. For what it's worth, Hayden Christensen does get to do his best work in the trilogy here, especially in the scenes with Ian McDiarmid, scenes which are one of the few things that shine through here. But Lucas continued to bog his character down with whining and clunky dialogue, something that is never more obvious than in the romantic scenes, where there is less chemistry going on than there is in the quantum realm, and, of course, the times where Anakin complains about Obi-Wan, in a tone that makes you want to slap the petulant toddler out of him. Lucas's tendency towards video game filmmaking is in overdrive in this film, with the opening scene, the astonishingly over-the-top final battle scene in the lava stream, all feeling entirely fake. It's choreographed to the pixel, and it's boring, at least to me. It's a film of extremes, really good stuff, and some really awful stuff. And it kind of cancels itself out in terms of its quality for me. It doesn't really stand out to me as being overall awful or overall great. I barely see it as a cohesive film, rather it comes over as a collection of scenes of varying quality. It's aggravating how wildly it swings from shit to shinola. And while it comes close at times to being a good film, it's too consistent. It's hampered by a lack of directorial and writing self-discipline to cross the line. It also feels like there was a rush to tie up all those loose ends, and man, there were so many problems and shortcuts taken to achieve that. For all the nitpickers out there, there's a treasure trove of things to mine, just in inconsistencies between the end of Episode 3 and the beginning of Episode 4, which makes me wonder quite how fully Lucas had actually thought it out, and how much he was writing on the fly. Yeah, that's a lot of complaints, and believe me, I haven't exhausted my problems with those films by any stretch of the imagination. It's very, very broken. That said, like with the early drafts of Episode 4, there are a lot of great ideas. Palpatine's seduction of Anakin to the dark side is fascinating. The political power grab and fall to a fascistic regime is great, though handled in a fumbling, drawn-out way. And there are, of course, some great set pieces. I mean, who doesn't like the Darth Maul three-way fight? That was quite something to see with John Williams' new work really amping things up. However, it's not enough to save this series of films. Overall, the prequels don't fit well with the OT in many ways. Trying to make everything fit together with the OT results in a bunch of problems, which are exacerbated by the violently differing tonal and visual style. And when it comes down to it, there's plenty of lore and canon violations with the OT along the way. Lucas also managed to make the same mistakes as he did before his friends intervened with the OT, and he did that all alone. He can't blame the budget, he can't blame the lack of purity of vision. It's all him, and him alone. He made the actors say the toneless, inhuman, wannabe Shakespearean gobbledygook. He wrote the drawn-out political essay that the Star Wars story sits between. He made the choice to make as much of the film CG as possible, so he could indulge his every whim. It's all him. The few good bits, and the many bad bits. It's all an exercise in lack of self-control. It's an imagination run wild without a head to guide it. But more about the man himself in the second part of this video. The sequel trilogy came at a point where many fans were still disgruntled with the prequels, though some had re-evaluated them in a more positive light. However, the general consensus was still that the prequels sucked horribly, and so there was a lot of excitement about the prospect of seeing the long-mooted closing 3 episodes with a new creative force behind it. With Lucas having sold the rights to Disney for an obscene amount of money, he handed over the keys to his legacy along with the outline for it going forward, and a president in the form of Kathleen Kennedy, previously the co-chair of Lucasfilm, and producer with a seriously impressive resume. Presumably Lucas thought that Kennedy would act as his proxy, giving him a loyal ear in the company, so he could continue to influence his creation's direction. And boy was he in for a disappointment. As soon as Disney had the rights signed and having given Lucas the overinflated payday of $4.05 billion, a price that was hundreds of millions of dollars over the estimated value of Lucasfilm, they pretty much threw away Lucas's treatment and approached the franchise like the business opportunity it was. And this was understandable, if a bit disappointing to some, as they wanted to bring Star Wars to a new generation, which, and let's be brutally honest here, means China. They wanted to hit the Chinese market where no one gave a nugget of shit about Star Wars, and this was the actual reason why The Force Awakens is pretty much a remake, with a large helping of reboot for the most part. For all the complaints J.J. Abrams gets, I do think he wanted to make a film that would appeal to the older fans, and it offers an olive branch to long-term viewers by not entirely negating the past films. It's pretty much the same story as Episode 4, with some additions and alterations, new characters, but largely familiar roles. Some familiar faces come back, some shockingly briefly, but in the new roster were some replacements that Disney hoped would catch our hearts. With The Force Awakens there was, at least for me, a lot to like. I know, that's fucked up, but there it is. Look, we'll start with the things that I liked about it, and then I can bitch about the stuff that was poorly thought out, or fucked up if you prefer. The Force Awakens is a stunningly beautiful film. It got away from the garish cartoon style, and Star Wars, in my opinion, hasn't looked any better than this. This is not in small part due to moving away from using all-encompassing CG to make the entire vista of wherever they were. The special effects are outstanding. I loved Kylo Ren's lightsaber despite the mocking that it got from fans, because it looked fucking vicious with the ragged, sparkling blade, and the fighting was moved away from the floaty gymnastics of the prequels to something more aligned with the original, only heavier and more medieval. Overall, the film looked and felt like a Star Wars film with a decent sense of humour, some potentially interesting new characters and openings for going ahead. Sure, it was recycled like hell, but it was generally fun, well-paced, and closer to the original Star Wars than any of the prequels, at least how I felt about it. However, yeah, there were problems from the start. The linchpin of the story is of course Rey, but this is a character that soon after her introduction becomes an all-powerful never-fail, and this was a problem that the series struggled with right through to the end. Now, don't get me wrong, as much as some may hate me for it, I enjoyed Daisy Ridley's performance. I find her fun and charming in the role, but I can't help but agree with those critical of the character being poorly handled from the writing point of view at least. A character who starts at or near the top with no fall from grace and minimal obstacles has no arc worth a damn. This is a real problem for the central character, and her character was the hook for the entire film series. It wasn't irredeemable at this point, though the next episode needed to be bloody good and build the characters. Oh dear. Taking over in the director's chair came Rian Johnson, director of the fairly well-regarded Looper, and from the start signs were there that he wasn't going to settle with making a predictable Star Wars. He was going to subvert your expectations. What we got was something that looked like Star Wars but ended up more or less trying to change the course for the new trilogy. I have to admit I rather enjoyed it the first time, with caveats, though I have come to the conclusion that I've had less personal involvement with Star Wars since the prequels effectively turned me away. I've seen it about 4 times since the cinema viewing, and I have to admit it really doesn't stand up, certainly with how it deals with the legacy characters. Han being skewered by Kylo in The Force Awakens at least made some sense. It's a father trying to save his son's soul, and he let his defences down, and he paid the price. The placing of this scene, however, didn't show much care. He should have at least had one outing with his friends. For all the faults of The Force Awakens, I'd say not reuniting the original characters was probably the most significant opportunity missed. But when it comes to Luke Skywalker, well, there were real mistakes made by The Last Jedi. I actually don't mind how we find him broken and hiding away, but the film doesn't take the opportunity to explore why a character who's been a courageous hero throughout 3 full films is now a slobbish hobo who's abandoned his friends. and it would have been very easy to have done that. If there had been some payoff for it, it may have at least given purpose to how the character was treated. This lack of care for the legacy characters is pretty horrible, and the perception that it's in service of bolstering a new lead is reasonable enough to warrant disdain. What's more, not even some of the new, interesting characters like Kylo, Poe or Finn get away from this sabotage either. Poe gets relegated to being an insubordinate mutineer who needs chastising by a purple-haired kamikaze pilot. Finn is reduced to building a brand new character via the film's most pointless, pace-breaking and baffling scene, and is otherwise sidelined. The way the Empire's slow chase of the rebels is broken up by a pointless long diversion to space Las Vegas is awful. Not only is it a largely confusing and pointless segue filled with preaching that seems designed to flesh out a secondary character, it makes no sense when it comes to the pacing. As slow as the fleet's chase is, it's desperate, but instead of keeping things going and solving the problems, these three characters just go off on a jaunt to a gambling town, while a pressing situation is abandoned until they eventually get back and take care of the problem, a problem that was apparently less serious than releasing alien racehorses and fucking up some rich folk. Even on the first viewing, this was intolerable. Then there's Kylo, the new threat. Perhaps one of the most interesting character opportunities in the film, never mind the engaging performance, and he keeps losing when pitted against the almighty Rey. What a waste! He's not a threat to Rey, and coupled with Snoke's sudden disposal, it makes you wonder if anyone involved was interested in following a path that may lead to something interesting. For all Rian Johnson's protestations of subverting expectations, he pinned his story on a character that couldn't be interesting. She was already at the top, and The Last Jedi went to pains to tell you that she had no history worth exploring. Let the past die. Kill it if you have to. They're words that could have had meaning if it didn't end up being a plea for you to forget your love for the story that came before. Rey had no connection to the story before. She was only there to replace it. I won't go too far into the film's massive list of problems, as it's all been said before, and while it can be watched for fun by someone not taking it too seriously, for the fans, it was fatally flawed and quite the slap in the face. I know it's a bit of a tired cliche of criticism to say slap in the face, but here it was clear that there was an animosity towards the fan in the press and from those involved with the film, and that suggests there was something of a fuck you going out there to the very people who were expected to turn up and watch it and everything else that was going to be turned out in the name of Star Wars. For me, the biggest problem with the film is that it simply doesn't fit from a story point of view. Like it or hate it, JJ's film did set up a lot of stuff with an interesting list of bad guys and good guys. When Johnson got his hands on this, he decided just to cut it all off and do his own thing, trashing most of what we had already begun to invest in, subverting our expectations, and most unforgivably, leaving the all-encompassing story in tatters by the end of the film. Snoke, dead. Luke, dead. Leia should be dead but survived, and is put in an important role for the sequel, despite Carrie Fisher having died a year before the film's release. Whatever the legacy characters were, is now gone. Any expectations for the promising characters has been subverted. They're not as important as you thought they should be, and Rey has a character arc with the gradient of a salt flat. I still enjoy the performance, but as a character, she faces very, very few challenges. The hero's story that characterised Star Wars in episode 1 through 6 is just not there. There's no stakes for her, no failure, no learning, no growth, and that's what makes her story inconsequential. And because the writers decided that she would be the focus at the expense of every other character around her, she takes all the other stuff down with her. Needless to say, the fan backlash was brutal, sometimes overstepping the mark, but not without reason. The laundry list of problems with the film ranged from nitpicks to outrage at how it threw so much that came before under the bus. It all poured out onto review sites, critiques and essays, while plenty of supporters of the film yelled entitled man baby back at them, and Disney struggled with how to react. So Johnson was out and JJ was drafted to helm the finale after Colin Trevorrow dropped out, likely due to where Johnson left the story in defiance of Carrie Fisher's death, and Abrams had his work cut out if he was to save the series. Oh God, was that an impossible mission. The Rise of Skywalker is an utter disaster. It's a broken, hacked-together movie by committee and hampered by an apparent obsession in the producer's office. Much has been said about the agenda of Kathleen Kennedy, so I won't go too far into it here, but there was an approach to the characters throughout the sequel trilogy that was pushed at the expense of the male characters, but instead of elevating them, it impacted upon the entire cast because of the sledgehammer approach that it took. Rise is a nightmare from the start, with so much needed to deal with, given the way that Johnson left it. It has a world of things to do, and unfortunately it has less than mature approach to correcting the problems, and it becomes obvious that the movie is partly being used to send a message to the previous director. I can only dream of having a fraction of this film's budget to send a fuck you to the next person that fucks with me, but as funny as some of that was, it let the fans down for the most expensive cheap shot that I've ever seen. The Force Awakens effectively soft rebooted the Star Wars series. Last Jedi outright killed the plot points from The Force Awakens, and Rise takes a shotgun and bollock blasts plot points from Last Jedi. I mean, holy shit. As a result of all of this, we spend a lot of time in Rise watching a push-me-pull-you toddler squabble that leaves us with a story that's a scramble to correct all the mistakes made by a rudderless cargo ship, captained by someone who left the directors a laundry list of social messaging instead of managing the heart of the story. For all the hate the MCU gets for not allowing the director's voice to take control, we can see the damage done when you make a trilogy/cinematic universe and don't plan it out in painstaking detail, an approach that necessitates putting visionary directors' whims and fancies in check. An epic list of problems to solve, it meant that the film had to take a million shortcuts, use plot convenience and jam a lot of stuff in that shouldn't have been necessary. As a result, the way that Rise is edited has the potential to cause concussion from rather hard cuts and short scenes intended to correct the last film, and this goes on and on at the expense of moving the film forward. It's exhausting. Going forward now meant that Abrams had little choice but to throw every plot convenience and contrivance at the screenplay while hiding it under frantic pacing. There's a rumoured 3-hour cut, but frankly I don't think this would fix more than a handful of the problems with the film. There's a solid 2 more movies, at least, needed to fix the problems here, and they were pissed down the drain with The Last Jedi. This isn't a trilogy, however you feel about the individual films. It's a chaotic collection of feature-length movies with a Star Wars theme. It's also a squabble played out at the cost of the fans, new and old, from both the prequel and OT teams, and financed with the kind of money that should make anyone with real problems in their life cry over how much good it could have done applied elsewhere. It's obscene and it's offensive, and it likely lost even those who had jumped on with this new series. I was willing to give it a chance, but even my charity was exhausted by the end, and I felt even worse than I did by the end of the prequels. In the second part of this look at Star Wars, we're going to look at the man behind the OT and the prequels, the man who many have been calling to bring back, and if that's even a good idea.